Hello, this is the 11th installment in Ralph K. Ginorio's History Behind the 9/11 Atrocities. We have gone through the events and the history of the Jewish people up to the diaspora in the year 135. We've gone to the history of Christianity up through its medieval Christendom and have made the argument as to the essential importance of Christianity as the core belief of Western civilization, the belief that people adhere to or fight against the central principle of the West. And now we're about to talk about the history of Islam. And before I do that, there are two things I need to say. First, in Islam, as in certain Eastern Orthodox branches of Christianity and certain aspects of the Jewish faith, there is an iconoclastic tradition. Iconoclasty is an absolute intolerance of images. Imagery, art itself is considered to be by the iconoclast to be an impertinent act because it takes the creative process out of the righteous hands of God and places them into the frail, fallible hands and sinful hands of human beings. Who are we to create? Who are we to create an image of God? It's an almost satanic idea. It's if you take Milton's quote about Satan, I'd rather rule in hell than serve in heaven, Satan is to have said. If you take the original satanic act of finding fault with God's creation in the first place and apply it to the creative process that leads to any form of art, you have some taste of what iconoclasty is. Now, I'm not saying at all that the Islamic civilizations and cultures that exist have no art, but their art tends to be abstract and geometrical, and the artist is always very careful in these societies that strictly adhere to a more iconoclastic interpretation of Islam to add a flaw, an intentional flaw, so that it is clear to everyone that the artist is not trying to mimic God, but is clearly a sub-creator, secondary creator, not trying to impertinently take and make a perfect thing, which is clearly beyond us. Now, this iconoclastic tradition exists. And it's part of the high point of civilization in the Islamic sense, and it is part of its low points as well. But in the modern context, there is, to a modern Western or Christian ear, the tinny tone of brittle intolerance. Christians went through a history that beat some of this moral certitude out of us, at least in terms of as a dominant cultural idea. What I mean by this is from the time that Gutenberg invents his printing press in the 1400s, up through the time of the accession of Louis XIV, the end of the English Civil Wars and the Glorious Revolution in the late 1600s, you have 150 to 200 years of brutal religious war between Roman Catholic Christians, Protestant Christians, and Reformed Christians. These religious wars were over the prize of becoming the next medieval Roman Catholic Church. In other words, the next central nervous system of Western civilization. So Catholics, Protestants, and variants of Reformed Christians all considered it absolutely worthwhile to wage brutal, vicious war upon one another in order to take control of the society. Well, we all know what happened. The peace that was established at the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648 encompasses pretty nicely the solution to the religious wars, which is the religion of the king in a region is the religion of that region. The religion of the king is the religion of his people. In other words, after nearly 2 centuries of brutal warfare, Christians had the notion of making a religious solidarity by political action and brutal military force kicked out of us. The most brutal war in German history is arguably not World War II. It's the 30 Years' War. In terms of percentage of the existent population affected, the percentage of economy destroyed, it is absolutely arguable that the 30 Years' War was a greater calamity than World War II. And the 30 Years' War was an aspect of this broader religious war. Now, what comes from this notion of live and let live between Protestant and Reformed Northern Europe and Catholic Southern Europe? And it's not an easy truce. There isn't easiness between Catholics and Protestants. My father-in-law was raised a Roman Catholic Italian in Connecticut, and the story goes in the family that he was excommunicated for having married my mother-in-law, who was a Protestant from Maine. I don't necessarily, I cannot vouch for the absolute accuracy of that, but it certainly reflects the spirit of the time. In my grandparents' generation and in my in-laws' generation, whether you were Catholic or Protestant mattered. It wasn't worth killing over, but it mattered. But what came from this willingness to live and let live was the philosophies of the Enlightenment and a willingness to exist in toleration of other ideas. And this notion of religious toleration was never intended to be religious neutering, which is what the anti-Christian and anti-religious forces in the West are trying to do today. What it was the sense that we are a society that is big enough, big-hearted enough, and big-minded enough to accept diversity, to accept dissenters. As members of our society who are loyal to many of the things in our society, but don't march in lockstep with every single thing. The process that brings the West from Christendom in the late Middle Ages and the mid-1400s to a tolerant secular society in the early 1900s that's still Christian, but is tolerant and secular oriented, is absolutely hardcore brutal. It took about 500 years. The Islamic world never went through that. They never went through that. They may be beginning to go through that now as a phase of world history, but they've never gone through that. The notion of a society separate from the core belief is alien to anyone who is raised in a traditional Islamist society or Islamic society. As medieval Christians could not imagine going through their daily life without reference to the church, Islam is the identity of every person within the society. There is no separation of church and state. There is no distinction between secular and religious matters. It's all one and the same. If you add the sincerity and the seriousness of Muslims when it comes to having Islam be at the center of their dealings in every aspect of their lives, with the traditional iconoclasty and hostility towards art, you get what we see in the modern world. Islamist clerics issuing fatwas against anyone in the Western world who shows disrespect to the Prophet Muhammad, as if the Western world was an annex of Islamist civilization. How dare they? How dare these clerics? How dare Islamists in general arrogate unto themselves the right to be our cultural masters? Now, they're doing this in reaction to European imperialism, which I'll get to. And they're doing it as an expression of Islamic pride and Islamic power. But it is utterly impertinent. It is as impertinent as a Christian, like myself, going into Islamic history with the intent of being hypercritical on a theological level from an Islamic basis. I am not qualified to do that by faith or training, and they are not qualified to issue death threats against the drawers of comic strips or the writers of satanic verses in Western societies. And this is one of the reasons why we have a war on terror. And this is one of the things that those people in the United States and in the West in general who want to make peace with Islam simply do not understand. Al Jazeera was established to spread the notion of Sharia law worldwide. It was not designed to give the American left one more media outlet with which to beat American conservatives. This will become evident as Al Jazeera's time goes on. I'm prefacing this because I'm going to talk about Islamic history as I understand it. I admit freely my understanding is flawed and limited. It comes from a traditional Western education in the United States, and it is not my intention to speak as a Muslim to other Muslims. It is my intention to speak as an American Christian about what I understand of Islamic history, and I admit the limitations and flaws of it. But in this world, there are people who cannot handle anyone but themselves speaking about the Godhead or the Prophet or anything. Well, this may irritate them. If so, God's will be done. So be it. I'm going to speak the truth. That's my calling. And I admit, my version of the truth is fallible and flawed. So, I'll start, and this no doubt will take several videos. When the Roman Empire falls in the West, the Roman Empire in the East is still strong. In fact, the Eastern Roman Empire will go on for another 1,000 years. It won't be until Turkish armies conquer Constantinople in 1453 that the Eastern Roman Empire finally falls. Western Empire fell in 476, Eastern Empire 1453. So the Eastern Roman Empire is Christian and is holding out. The Eastern Roman Empire includes what we now consider to be the Near East, what many people call the Middle East, which is the region of Anatolia that we call Turkey, Syria and Israel and Jordan, Egypt, Libya, Tunisia, Algeria, Morocco, the entire Mediterranean basin is Christian at this time. And the Christians are involved in a death struggle with the Zoroastrians of the Sassanid Persian Empire. In this context, in the year of the elephant, the Prophet Muhammad is born. Without going into too much detail, Muhammad starts speaking much like the Prophet Abraham spoke. He speaks of God speaking to him. Now, Muhammad is of Mecca, and at the time, Mecca is a caravan crossroads town in the Hejaz of what is now Western Arabia. Now, if you look at ancient maps, you will see the curve of empire now described by the Jordanian-Iraqi border. No self-respecting ancient empire, not Babylon, Egypt, Persia, or the Parthians, ever took an area south of the Tigris-Euphrates Valley and the area of the Jordan River, because it was considered to be a blasted desert wasteland where there is nothing of value to be gained. So the Arabian Peninsula was a backwater in ancient civilization. From time to time, like Moses going to the tribes of Midian, it appeared and was a place that people retreated to and came back from, but it was not a powerhouse. It was a backwater. And the crossroads town, the caravanserai town of Mecca, was a place where caravans could replenish and refuel, and they had a tourist spot, the Kaaba, which at the time was a chamber that supposedly housed the spirits of all the pagan gods. And it was a tourist spot, and it was a religious aspect. Well, Muhammad's insistence on having heard the truth from God began to trouble the leading citizens of Mecca, who depended upon the monies from the Kaaba to fund their lifestyles, and who frankly didn't want to be disturbed. Now, what Muhammad said is, among other things, that God has been trying to get through to us stubborn, stupid creatures for a long time. He tried with the Jewish faith, but the Jews got it wrong. Strike one. They made the law into a God, whereas God is above and beyond the law. God tries again by sending the prophet Jesus Christ. But the Christians get it wrong. Steer right too, because the Christians believe that the prophet Jesus is the Son of God, confusing the speaker with the message. There is no God but God, and Mohammed is his prophet. Mohammed harkens back to an absolutely Unitarian, monotheistic principle of God that considers the Trinitarian notion of most Christians to be a step towards paganism, and that considers themselves to be the true inheritors of Abraham because they speak in a universalist terms, not in terms of an ethnic faith. Mohammed becomes so obnoxious to the leaders of Mecca that they are going to kill him. And in the year 622, Mohammed and his followers engage in Hejira. They sneak out of Mecca and escape through the desert with hostile Meccan soldiers hot on their trail. Like the Christian faith during the time of the first Easter, all Muslims at this point, or all followers of Muhammad, can fit into a small traveling party. We'll pick up the story of Hejira later and the Islamic faith. Thank you for your